Started. So since we're talking about firewall policies, we're talking about security profiles, and I'm sure the expectation here is, hey, we're going to go ahead, we're going to jump on the firewall and go configure something. And I promise we'll get there eventually, but that's really putting the cart in front of the horse. I mean, you think of something like the Bank of America building. It's a fantastic building. It's got a beautiful top to it, and they didn't start by building the top down. They start by building the ground up. So that's our first building metaphor for this morning. First thing we want to do is actually plan out what we're doing and figure out the best way of going about implementing what we're trying to do. So the very first thing we want to take a look at is, why are you making firewall changes in the first place? I know this sounds really, really simple and really basic. It's, well, someone asked me to. If the way you manage doing firewall changes is someone walks up to your desk and asks something, if it's an end user and not your CIO, CISO, someone like that, the conversation should start with, oh my God, we can't get money in the bank, or oh my God, I think we're being hacked. If it's not something to that severity, you should probably have some sort of policy in place for how you go about making firewall changes. It should not be the wild, wild west when it comes to this type of stuff. Now, what that's going to look like is going to depend on where you're at in your security model. So someone who is very on the starting end of the security model, maybe that policy is simply a matter of the user emails the help desk gives me a ticket and I go work on it. There's no real approval, there's no real oversight, but at least you have a documented process for why you did it. Someone on the high end of the security model, on the other hand, may have a CISO group that has specific people assigned to approve changes. So the change comes in and they have to review it, they okay it, they give it to you as the network security admin to actually implement, and you only make the changes that they have approved. The reality for most people is you're going to fall somewhere in between there. A real common way I see that people do it is if Jane over in HR needs access to Facebook chat because she's using it to interview candidates that are hiring through Facebook, then maybe the correct approval process is she sends it up the chain to her manager makes the actual request. That way she has got approval from her chain of command, and that request comes to you and implements it. That's a decent middle ground. But the bottom line is, make sure you've developed some sort of policy internally for how you go about doing this. It'll make people think about what they're asking. B, it gives you the audit trail for what changes were made and why, which is usually going to be important. And C, you don't want to play the blame game, but one of the first things they teach you when you go to medical school is that you're going to lose a patient. Someone's going to die on your table at some point in time. It happens. At some point in time, you're going to make a firewall change that breaks something, has some unintended consequence. Having an approval process means that you're still going to feel bad about having impacted the business in some way with your change, but at least you can show, well, this is what was asked. This is who looked at it. We had second set of eyes that said, yep, that sounds good. We implemented based on that, and there was an unforeseen problem. So at least at that point, you're not having to shoulder the entire responsibility for why something went wrong. Once you've done that, you need to start gathering your data. If you're the person who's going to be implementing this, no one should know better than you what you actually need in order to actually implement the security rules you're trying to do. So you need to start thinking about what you're doing, how you're doing it, in terms of building blocks to build out your rules. So one of the easiest ways of doing this is to start enabling the people around you. Now, to some extent, this may apply to the end user who's making the request. Honestly, this is probably going to apply more for your help desk, your desktop support, people who are playing the middle ground between the user making request and you implementing it. So you want to start thinking, what do I actually need to know in order to implement this, where I and whoever's requesting are not sending 10 emails back and forth and wasting each other's time. And because we're talking Palo Alto here, you're going to start thinking about some next level stuff of what you need. So one of the easiest ways of doing this is to build yourself an actual firewall request form that's going to have the key information you want. So here is a real basic example of what you might be looking for. I'm going to want to know who's making the request, how do I get a hold of them, phone and email, what department are they part of. System name may or may not be important. If the rule is less for a user and more for what system they have, that could come into play. When are they making a request? For the rules themselves, you're going to see stuff we always have seen in every firewall form that's ever existed. Hey, I want the source IP, the destination IP, the port number. But again, because we're talking Palo Alto, we're talking next generation. We've already elevated ourselves as our network security admins to think at next generation level. We want to bring everyone else up with us. So we want to actually know what applications are involved, what user or Active Directory group that this is going to apply to. If you're going to a particular URL, what URL is it? Give us a reason, description. This traffic is to allow this application to function because Microsoft says it does, and here's a link to the guide. Something of that nature. Duration is important. Is this a temporary rule? Is it a permanent rule? If it's a temporary rule, is it going to go for the next unknown length of time while you're testing, or is it a preset, hey, this rule is only going to apply for the next 3 months while we do a migration type process? And then you're going to want something at the bottom to sign it out. Now, this form is not going to be the be-all, end-all for every firewall request you're ever going to get out there. If you have your application team is going to come through and build up new servers for a new SQL instance and everything else, for example, 2 rules are not going to cover that. So, maybe it's, hey, I fill out a spreadsheet that's got this identical information into it because there's 30 rules are involved. Here you go. Now, this form is just really basic and really, really generic. How you apply it is going to depend, again, on where you are in that security lifecycle model. So, for example, if you are on the low end of that model, maybe you take this form, you print it out, and it gets filled out, signed, and given to you in paper copy. Maybe one step up there, maybe you're scanning the form, and so you have a digital copy. On the far end of that security maturity model, maybe this is not a Word document. Maybe this is a form fillable PDF that your users or your help desk fills out. They use your smart card certs to actually digitally sign it. Maybe if the CISO is reviewing it, then maybe the CISO team digitally signs their approval when it comes back to you as a actual signed instance that you have there. So when you've got this form filled out, then you can actually start building out what you want to do to implement it. So this is the point where you start looking at, well, I'm going to go into the firewall and make changes. Before I do that, though, I do want to show 2 things that might be useful to you, particularly as you start enabling people. And when I talk about enabling, again, I'm not necessarily meaning Jane in HR, the person who asked for Facebook chat. There's going to be a limit to how much you're going to enable your end users. And honestly, some of that's going to depend on what industry you're in. So if you're a research and development company, you probably have fairly technical end users. Now, they may not know anything about firewalls, but they know what applications running on the computer. Hey, I need this for Adobe Acrobat. I need this for Adobe Flash. My Microsoft System Center antivirus just keeps popping up and saying that it can't download updates, whatever the issue may be. Whereas, if you're an accounting firm, you're probably not going to have terribly technical users. Where this enablement really comes in handy is when you're dealing with the rest of the IT group. Because you'll find typically that at least half the rules you're going to get rule requests for are going to come from internal. It's going to be new applications your team is developing and pushing out for your end users. It's going to be new servers your server admins are standing up and delivering, things of that nature. So these are all people that may never touch the interface of a firewall in their entire IT career, but certainly going to understand the concepts behind what is an application, why do we identify an application. So one of the things you can do to help enable them is Palo Alto has a really cool site that you can send to them here. So if you've ever looked at the application section of the firewall, this should look very, very familiar. But this is actually, Appipedia is out here on the web. You can go to it and you can do the same type of searches that you would do on the firewall itself. So like if I wanted to look at SMB, what do I have for SMB issues or applications? Hey, I've got, base, I got 1, 2, 3, your typical stuff. So if I am the SQL guy and I know that, my file shares going back and forth to my 2016 servers are all going to be SMB version 3, I can look it up here and go, oh, the application is ms-ds-SMBv3. Put it on the form. So I have found that in companies I work with that actually start sharing this out, it's less impact on the people doing actual firewall rules because they're getting better data than they would be if they're just getting blind. I need traffic over this port type stuff. So once we're going to do that, we're going to build out our elements. We're going to create the best policy we can. We're going to test it. And then we're going to move on to the next thing we've got going on. So let's jump into the firewall itself here. So this is one of my test firewalls here. Before we get to the actual parts of rules, we're going to take these building blocks and we're going to do something useful with them. So here's our next building metaphor for the morning. You don't go ahead and slap 2x4s up against a wall and use it to actually try to build whatever structure you're constructing. You take your groups, you lump it together, you pre-cut, you pre-measure. By the time you're actually at the assembly on the frame stage of things, everything should be exactly sized the way it should be, the right material, and you should have enough to just roll smoothly into things. It's the same idea. So before we ever put a firewall rule in, we're going to build out all the individual building blocks that are required for that rule to work correctly. And the first thing we're going to look at is not the rule itself. It's going to be the security profiles, because this is a next generation firewall. We are going to do next generation stuff. So we want to build out the security policies that are going to apply. And we're going to start with antivirus. Now, one thing you'll see as we go through here is that Palo Alto has given us default security profiles all throughout. That's really cool. That's really nice of them. We're going to throw them out the window. Not because their defaults are not good, but because they are locked. They are predefined. They are exactly what they are. We cannot make changes. So on day one, you may not have a reason to change the security profile. You may go, yep, those settings look great. But what happens when you get to day 100 and all of a sudden you have very customization type stuff you have to do because of a new environment that's been stood up? If you have to go back and change all the rules that go in to this to use a new security profile, that's a lot of extra work on your part. So your best bet is to go ahead and customize your profiles from the start so that you can apply them correctly without having to do a lot of rework. This is not bad though. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually come in here and we're going to clone this. We're going to call it, we'll call it custom AV. So as you can see right here, we have all the stuff that was already in the default. One of the things that jumps out at me when it comes to the antivirus here is this mail stuff. It's just set to alert. So much of threats come through mail. There's no reason for this to be alert. And in fact, Palo Alto's own best practice, if you've ever been through one of our BPA sessions, for example, is to come back and change these, which does mean that, yes, Palo Alto's own default doesn't meet their own best practice anymore. It's fine. They're giving you options. So we're going to come in here and we're going to set reset for these mail stuff here. So we've already customized it. We're going to allow wildfire on that type of traffic. On this particular case, we're not going to worry about packet captures. Let's assume this is a firewall for a small organization. They don't actually have a SOC. Packet captures are cool, but they're not going to have any real chance to make use out of them. So we're not going to take up space in the box doing them. So we're going to say, okay, we have our custom AV profile. Cool. We're going to repeat this process through here. So now we're going to look at our anti-spyware. Once again, we're going to come into our strict profile. We're going to clone it. And we'll call it custom AS. So here, things look a little bit better. So we have our criticals, highs, and mediums. They're all set to reset. Our default actions on simple and low. We're going to come in here, and let's say we're just going to come in here and change these specifically to alert. Because the odds are that if it's a informational or a low, it's probably going to be a false positive. So we don't want to be blocking it, but we want the visibility into what it actually is. So we'll set that to alert. Again, we're not going to actually do anything with the packet captures on this particular one. We're going to come over here, and you can see we do have some DNS signature sinkhole type stuff going on. On this one, we'll say, yeah, if we've actually sinkholed bad DNS traffic, we'll go ahead and packet capture that one. So now we have our anti-spyware. Vulnerability protection is actually the big one. This is, to me, the biggest reason why you would do this. So from what I've seen in my 5 or 6 years of administering Palo Alto, is that their antivirus and their anti-spyware tends to have a very, very, very low rate of false positives. They're actually really good about not having a lot of things that you'll have to go back and tweak and fix. So for them, the only reason you're really cloning is to future-proof it and also to make the minor tweaks you saw me make with the email and with the packet capture on the sinkhole stuff. Vulnerability protection is different. So vulnerability protection is really, when you think traditional IPS, you think signatures that are firing off against things, this is where a lot of that comes in. And it's pretty common to end up with exceptions over here in most production environments. So in this case, we're going to come in here. We're going to repeat the same idea that we're going to come in here with our informational and our lows, and we're going to set them to alert. And you'll see that we have client and we have server because it's looking at traffic in multiple directions. So we're going to go ahead and do it to both of these. Cool. So now we have our custom thing. The other thing we'll tend to customize over here in antivirus or vulnerability protection, I don't know what I call it, is that we are going to have exceptions, like I said. So you can come in here and you can find all the actual stuff going on here, and you'll find that, like, for example, one of the really common ones I see through here that ends up being accepted is the Ssh Brute Force. So there is a signature in here that fires if there are, for example, if there are more than 20 SSH attempts to a single IP from a single IP over a 60-second time frame. And that makes sense. You think, okay, it's protecting against some sort of denial of service, brute force, password cracking type stuff. Rock on. The problem with that is so many modern file transfer clients are designed at the application level to accept as many streams as they can possibly get. And application sending files are set to send as many streams as they can possibly get. So if the server settings, application settings, CPU cycle, so on and so forth that are dictating this on the actual boxes transferring files will permit, they may open 60 SSH sessions in that single minute to try to push files as quickly as possible, which means when it comes over here and hits this vulnerability protection profile, it is going to actually have an issue and block that traffic because it's go, hey, this is a brute force attempt. In reality, it's legit. So that's one I see a lot that gets cleared up into here. So you're going to want that ability to come in here and adjust that and say, okay, maybe I'm exempting this IP from the signature because this is having this problem. URL filtering is another one you're almost always going to end up having customization for, because this one, more than anything else in here, is less a technical thing, is more going to come back to corporate policy. So you can see over here we have all of our different categories. And some of this you may go, well, of course, we're going to block adult, we're going to block command and control, we're going to block certain things here that we know are not good. There are definitely malicious, but some of these things are more questionable. For example, if you have dating, do you block access to dating sites? That's not really going to be a IT security decision usually. That's going to be a business policy decision. So for example, if the business has a written policy that on your lunch break, users can go from their computer to the internet, wherever they'd like, as long as they're not going to any sites that are malicious and do whatever they want, then on the IT side, it's very hard for us to actually say, no, you can't do that. Now, we may not agree with that policy, but because that's done at the corporate level, we have to allow it. On this other hand, a very secure site that's dealing with, it's the nuclear power plant, for example, they may have a very, 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 very strict policy that says you can go online, but only to do banking. So maybe your customer here is you're blocking dating and you're blocking education and entertainments, but you're allowing, financial services. So you can get really, really tight with this. The other thing you're going to be looking at here is the newer versions of Palo Alto, and this is running 8.0. It has the ability to control whether you allow credential submission on websites, which is really, really powerful. It's anti-phishing protection, basically. So, if the user ends up going to a site, and it's not a case of the site being malicious, but a case of the site being compromised, for example, where the site's going to classify, okay, you're going to a legitimate site, you're going to msn.com. That's permitted, sure. But it turns out msn.com has been compromised, and now there's, you can think of it as a skimmer sitting there that's capturing the information you're putting in the fields. if you turn credential submission blocking on here, then that user may go to that site, but they can't actually sign into it. Palo will actually block that action. So at that point, you're protecting them against, not going to malicious sites, but against legitimate sites that have got malicious content on them. So now we're going to look at our file blocking. So we're going to come in here. File blocking is a tricky one because it depends on your environment. This is not one you can just turn on wildly without doing some investigation to what you're actually doing. Because some of this stuff you're like, okay, well, I mean, sure, I can block all these things, and you'll find custom applications that are moving files back and forth to partners across the internet that happens to be a file you've blocked. The file transfer from coming in, you can get in some strange situations. So you definitely turn this on in chunks. But the general idea is you have different file types, and you're going to block certain types of files. So some of this you may look at and go, exe, but I have users have a legitimate reason for downloading exes. Honestly, that's unlikely, but it could be. But do those users have a legitimate reason to download batch files or DLL files or Windows screensaver files? I remember the last time I had a legitimate reason to download a Windows screensaver file. I think it was 1998. So probably not. So a lot of these you can come through here and safely block. You can also control whether you want to block encrypted files here for zip files and RARs, which is actually a cool thing. So you may say we transfer files back and forth with partners. We're going to allow zip files, but we don't want them to be encrypted. We want to be able to actually capture that if need be. So you can come through here. You can add in stuff. We can say this is going to be a log rule for one type of rule. We're going to come in here and say this is going to be, we're going to add in ACE files, but we're only going to do it when we're looking at, actually, let's not do this. There we go. But we're only going to look at ACE files or coming through if someone has sent it through Office 365. So you can get really customization going on there. So hopefully you all know what Wildfire is. Wildfire is, Palo Alto's don't call it a sandbox in that it takes files, looks at the code behind them. If they're EXEs, it runs it against the environment. It does it in a variety of ways against different types of virtual systems, and is intuitive enough that it can actually shunt that traffic off to physical hardware. That was actually a big issue. I think about 3 years ago, there was a virus that came through, and all these next generation platforms, including Palo Alto, were running, basically a VMware-based virtual environment to do all this against. And this particular virus strain got past all of them because it was smart enough to detect it was virtual. It was smart enough to avoid the capture because it was VMware specific. So I know that what Palo Alto has done since then is I know that they're actually using some form of hypervisor that's been customized to make it less obvious to malware that it is virtual. And there are now mechanisms in place to send it through a physical lab if it thinks for any reason that this is trying to not run just because it takes some sort of virtual system to it, which I'm sure has definitely increased the level of reliability in terms of the signatures coming through. So this is one where you may customize it, you may not. I recommend doing it just to have the options available. So that you can come in here and you can say, well, I'm going to do Wildfire, but I'm going to control, applications. You'll see this is a very similar list that we were just looking at. You can customize what file types you want to send, whether you're sending it inbound, outbound, both. If you have the WF500 box, which is the on-premise Wildfire box that you'll use in environments that have really, really tight data security. So hospitals, for example, which have very specific HIPAA requirements about what they can and can't send off-premise, WF500s does not do the full Wildfire that the public cloud does, but does a subset of it. You can control that through here. It's a sort of a where do you control traffic type thing. So you can create your custom wildfire profile and say that I'm only going to send certain types of files and control, whether you're using wildfire for everything through here. Probably a more common use case is going to be to have a custom rule that's just going to exempt out wildfire if it's traffic that you, for compliance reasons or business policy reasons, can't send out. So this is our data filtering. You'll see there's actually not a default here. So data filtering is an interesting one. I think anyone at Palo Alto would be the first people to tell you that they are not a true DLP solution, in the sense that true DLP solutions have mechanisms to validate information. So if a DLP solution comes across credit card data, it has ways of validating, is that legitimately a credit card, or is that false string that just happens to flow a false positive? This is not doing it. It's doing some, very specific matches. You can definitely turn this on. You can definitely use it. It's certainly not a bad idea. Definitely start with it in alert mode. You want to see what type of traffic you're going to get. You'll want to fine tune that. And then most importantly, when you put it into block mode, you're going to want to make sure that you have a policy in place for how you handle people that get flagged as a false positive. How do you validate it really was a false positive, or if it is someone who is sending something that they should be, but maybe they're in a very, very limited use case where they have a legitimate business reason to send this data you're flagging on, everyone else doesn't. Make sure you have everything in place before you turn that on. Otherwise, you're going to get overwhelmed. So once we have this here, we're going to build out our actual security profile group here. So we're going to call this our custom group. And in this, we're going to come through, we're going to select our profiles we just created, our custom AV, our custom AS, so on and so forth. So now we have an actual group that we can apply. So the advantage of the group is it means we can throw everything at a rule at one time. At the same time, you'll see when we go to create the rules, we do have the ability to go through there and say, well, on this particular rule, I want all these to apply except URL filtering. Maybe this is traffic hitting internal URL web server and it's causing issues for users, or it's causing a web call to fail because there's not an actual user to respond correctly. So just because you created a group doesn't mean you have to use that group in every rule. You'll see that we have customization there for that. So now let's go through and let's go ahead and start building out our rules. So once again, more building block type stuff. We're going to come in here and we're going to build out the components that are needed to build that rule first. You don't have to build these components first, by the way. You can do it through the rule, as you'll see when we go to create it. But for me, at least, it's more logical for me to create my objects first and then apply them. It makes sure that when I have 20 different objects I'm having to create as part of a set of rules, I've gone through all of them. So let's say this is going to be an internal web server that is going out to a partner to transfer information. So let's say this is, we'll create this here. We'll give it a name. We're going to go ahead and give this an IP. So we're going to say it's 192.168.125. We didn't really talk tags. That's how you use tags properly, and using tags is really could be a much longer conversation. But at a very high level, if you're not familiar with them, is that the idea of a tag is you can tag groups of rules, groups of objects a certain way, and then use that for filtering and discovering stuff. So for example, let's say you had an application that runs in your environment. You're a 3-tier environment and you have tests and production. By 3-tier, I mean you have a web layer, you have an application layer, you have a database layer. But they're all tied back to this one particular app. So you may have a tag for presentation, you may have a tag for application, you may have a tag for your database, you may have a tag for tests, you may have a tag for production, but you could also have a tag for that one application. So regardless of what tier it's on, it would get that application tag, the objects would get the application tag, the rules would get the application tag. So if you had a reason to, let's say auditor came in and said, I want to see all your traffic that involves this subset of FTI data, for example, you could grab that tag and boom, there you go. Here's all your objects, here's all your rules, here's all your profiles. So you could give the auditors a very specific abstract from your system of here is exactly the information you're looking to see. Because that one environment may be 1 of 30 environments you have, and that may be 50 rules out of 500 on the box. So it makes your job in presenting data a lot easier if you've got tags in place. So we're going to create this here, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to create our destination server as well. And you do note, as we go through here, I'm using specific IP addresses in this case. We can also change this. So if we had a range of IPs, we could put this in here and say it's, like that. We could actually do a whole network itself if we wanted to, if that was really like a /24. You can also do fully qualified domain name. Now, the one thing I will caution you with the FQDN is that there's a limited use for that. If it is referring to something in your internal DNS and there's only going to be a couple responses you could ever come back for it, cool, go for it. If you're doing FQDN across the internet, then as long as you got your DNS working correctly and it's a site that's just, it's not going to change, that's fine. If you were trying to do FQDN to, something over in AWS, for example, or you're trying to do FQDN to hit stuff Akamai, it changes so often and there are so many results. What happens is behind the scenes is Apollo is going through and it's caching these DNS responses for these FQDNs, but there is a limit to how much it can actually cache. So I honestly don't remember what it is in 8. I know in 771 it was 32 IPv6 and 32 IPv4 results. So if you have something that has 200 potential results and doing it by FQDN, you're basically playing Russian roulette with whether it will actually resolve the correct name. Cool. So we've created our groups there. We're going to come in here. Now we're going to make a rule. So you see in this particular case, we have a very limited number of rules that are on display. This is a limited test environment. What we're trying to do doesn't match any of what we've got here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to make a new rule. We're going to call it one thing I do encourage is try to make your names for your rules useful. If you have a small environment, you can be very, very detailed in what it is. The larger you are, probably the less information you can put in the name, but don't name it 1, 2, 3, 4 or something useless. You want to be able to do something that is going to actually provide value when you name it. You can throw a description here and say, I believe it is May the 4th. So at this point, now from an audit perspective, I could go through and see the configuration logs and see that I was the person who put this rule in, but this also makes it very apparent in the rule. Why is this rule here? I don't understand what it does. Oh, I see Jason put it in. Well, maybe I can ask him. Put information there that's going to be useful to you. So our source here, we're going to come in and we're going to say this is from our servers. And then we're going to come in here and here's our source server we just configured. We're not going to worry about user in this case. We're going to say this is a web call being made. So there's not a user on the box that's going from that server to the warehousing partner. If this were something for a end user trying to access resources, this is where you go to configure that user ID or use user ID. You configure it separately. But in this case, web call, we're not going to deal with it. Our destination here, we're going to say, well, they're going to any zone, or we could say they're going to go to a specific zone. In this case, we know it's going to the internet, so it's our outside zone. And we're going to throw our warehouse address in. Now for applications, and this should all come off that firewall request form, by the way. This is where you would get that information. From applications, we know we need a couple things. We need, if they're going to have some web browsing. We have some SSL. And we're going to have some file transfer. So actually, there we go. For our ports, all these are using default ports. So when we say default port, what does that mean? Well, for web browsing, and you'll see this when you go to the Appipedia, for example. In fact, I think I still have it up here. Yeah, so you can look at when you come in here and you look at your application, you can do this to the firewall, you can do it to the Appipedia. But you see standard port is TCP 80. So when we look at default or application default for the services for these rules, what that means is we're looking at the application web-browsing and we're looking at it over port 80. Now, if it turns out web browsing to this particular site is actually 8080, for example, this rule will not work because it's only going to accept the traffic on port 80. So that's when we come in here and we'd add a custom port and everything else. But for this, we're going to assume SSL is running 443, SCP is going to run 22, the web-browsing is going to run 80. Not worry about URL categories. This is really more if you're customizing the rule for specific categories. We are going to allow that traffic. We're going to log it. Now, here's where we get to our security profiles we created. So I have a couple options. Right now, it's set to none. So basically, at this point, this would act as a layer 7 rule with no threat prevention, no URL filtering, no wildfire, nothing like that turned on. So we can come in here and we can assign our group that we just did. If we only want certain profiles to apply, we could actually go profile, and just like the group, we can select custom ones. So maybe we want custom AV, custom vulnerability protection, custom spyware. Because as a web call, maybe we say, hey, we don't want URL filtering, but we're going to want to do everything else. So you can play around with that. And then we've created our rule. Now, the problem is, if you look over here, there is a catch-all rule right here that's just allowing all traffic out while this environment is being built out. We're putting our more specific traffic in. So we want to make sure this rule gets up to the point where it's not hitting the catch-all rule and not hitting this rule. So we're going to go ahead and move this up to the top. We're going to move it down below our temp test rule, and it can stay right there. We can also turn around and say, hey, the server's update rule, now we have our security profiles built out. We want to go ahead and control, and turn threat prevention and everything on. So we can come over here and click where it says none, grab our group, apply it. So we have a little bit of time. So let me show you a couple other things that could be handy to you. So let's go back to our objects here. So as you saw when we did that, we put our applications, multiple ones, in the same rule. We only had 3. It's not a big deal. But let's say you had 10 or 20 different rules, or 20 different applications you want to go on your rule. So we can come over here and we can make an application group just as easily. So let's just say this is our Acme transfer group. We could type it in manually if we know what it is. We can also come over here, and you'll see this is a very similar setup as our Appipedia, as our application thing. So let's look for web-browsing. Here we see that. We also see every use case that actually calls upon it as a dependency. So that one's not going to work very well. But hey, here we get this one right off the bat. So for our web browsing, this one we will actually type in. So now we can go back to our policy here, and we can update it. Instead of using all these, and put our transfer group instead. So last thing I will show you real quick here. So let's say that you don't want a group, you don't have a specific need for those applications, but you want to allow something across the board for a type of application, and you don't want to have to own maintaining that. So we can also do an application filter. So we'll come in here, we're going to add this in. So let's say we want to filter all peer-to-peer traffic. So at this point in time, without any further customization, any application that Palo Alto classifies as peer-to-peer, we can now come in here and control. So we're going to add a quick rule here. We're going to say any source, any destination, you can see we have applications that match that. There's our application filter there, and we're going to deny it. And we'll move this to the top. So the power of doing that filter is, at this point, it takes every application that's currently identified as peer-to-peer and will block it. More importantly, let's say Palo Alto throws 3 more peer-to-peer applications out next month as part of the application update. I don't have to know what those are or care what those are. As soon as they get into the box, that filter will add them as well. So I can continue to dynamically block that entire category of applications without me having to ever know which applications are being hit by that filter. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and we're just going to open this up for any questions that you might have.
And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section there at the bottom of your Zoom.
So while people think about potential questions, I'll just go over our upcoming opportunities for more webinars real quick. Coming up in June, as Leo mentioned, we have one on how to build and leverage reports. So there's a variety of reports that Palo Alto can do. We're going to go through how you build them out and which ones are useful, which ones are useful only in certain environments and certain situations. Following that, in July, we're going to do a session on Panorama best practice design. We're also going to show you the cloud implementation for Panorama. And then in August, we're going to be doing a thing on designing and deploying Palo Alto firewalls and Microsoft Azure. So if you've not messed with any of the cloud stuff, Azure or AWS, you'll find it's very, very, very different environment than your traditional firewall stuff. So hopefully that will be one everyone finds a lot of interest in.
All right, great. Well, if there's no questions, we'll give you guys back a little time on your Friday here. And as I hit on at the beginning, we will be posting this onto YouTube along with the past few events that we've held, the last few webinars. So, and actually, I think we just got a question here. So,
we do have a question here.
Yeah, Jason, if you want to hit on that.
Say you have a policy that has multiple applications with one of them on a non-default port. If you create the policy specifying the port for each application, does it now allow traffic for an application on any of those ports? The non-default port. So if you create the policy and you specify the port for each of those applications individually, so typically what you're going to end up doing, if I'm getting what you're asking correctly, so if you had 6 different applications that were involved in traffic from source A to destination B, and one of those was on a non-default port, or you had a case where one application had both default and non-default, the easiest way of doing that, honestly, is going to be split those into 2 separate rules. So if 5 of those applications are using default ports, you put those in one rule. And if one application could be using default and non-default, SQL is a good example. So, SQL, you have 1443, you could have, what is the other one, 1969, are real common. Well, only one of those is going to be default port in Palo Alto. So in that case, you're going to actually turn around and make that a separate rule. And you'd put both the default port and the non-default port in manually, so that you actually got both of them in the rule. Does that answer what you're asking there? Perfect. Perfect. So yeah, I mean, the catch there is to make sure that if you're putting a custom port in and you have stuff that's using default as well, you've accounted for both. Because if you just put in the custom port by itself, it does not allow default as well unless you manually specify that. Good question.
Awesome. Well, Jason, great job. Really appreciate you driving this for us. We appreciate all the attendees taking the time to hop on today. Thank you very much for your time. And we'll get you a follow-up email with some information on these next webinars we're going to be hosting. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day, everyone.